I'm a writer by training, a novelist, but I've grown increasingly interested in the last couple of years with telling stories not just through words, but through images, and also the collision of words and images. And I've grown increasingly interested in our cultural fascination with information graphics, which is one way to tell the story very quickly of a huge data set. Now we have access to the data, and the question is, what do we do with them? How do we tell compelling stories? And one way that we've figured out is through graphics that tell a large amount of information very quickly. And they produce in me, I don't know about you, I don't want to speak for the room, what I have termed the infogasm, in that you have this very almost visceral, erotic reaction to something like this map of the US, where you're suddenly inundated with this tremendous amount of information that you sort of instantly grasp, and there's this flush of excitement, and you're like, this is great. And then you kind of move on, and you sort of forget what was there, and you're kind of on to the next thing. There's this excitement, and then there's this kind of release, and then you forget. And newspapers, all media outlets, have figured out that these infogasms are quite sexy, and that they move a lot of copies. So you're seeing it more and more in this country, but particularly in Europe, and for instance, Spain, which is right now the capital of information graphics. Almost every front page has some kind of image, graphic like this, depicting some element of our society. What's interesting to me about an information graphic that's particularly well done is that, yes, it gives you this kind of instantaneous flush of information, but there's this sort of unraveling story if you stick with it a little bit more. So, for instance, this is a really interesting map that shows the electoral shift in 2008. And so it's not how a state voted, it's how much it changed from 2004. Okay? So that's important because a lot of the West, right, went Republican. But a lot of the West went more Democratic overall. In fact, almost all of the country in 2008 voted more Democratic than as compared to 2004, except the Bible Belt, which is important. I mean, I think you get a story in this graphic that you wouldn't have got any other way. And in fact, of course, 2 years later, this became the seed of the Tea Party movement right here. But there's all kinds of stories embedded in this, right? When I see this, I want to know, what happened in this county? What happened in Massachusetts, which actually was one of the few states that went more conservative? Was it just because John Kerry wasn't running, or did Massachusetts, massholes, I can say that because I'm from Massachusetts, did they have a problem with Barack Obama? And I think the great thing about information graphics is that they can tell stories like this in a way that no other medium can, right? You could write a whole article about this, and it wouldn't convey the breadth of information as quickly as a graphic can. So I want to today unpack a little bit of this. What do information graphics do? And I think one of the things that I think is important to realize is that we see these, and at least for me, they sort of go around my critical thinking skills, right? I'll scrutinize an article, I'll be like, come on. But somehow graphics have this power where we don't question them enough, I think. I don't know if this is because we're not equipped, we haven't been taught the critical thinking skills, or because there's something going on neurophysiologically in our heads, and this is something that I also want to look at. There's been a lot actually written about how we process images, and I think a lot of you work in professions that deal heavily with images and are probably familiar with a lot of the neuroscience. And so I'm not going to go too deeply into that. But one thing that I wanted to just highlight is Pavio's dual coding theory, which is, I think, from the late 70s. And there's been some pushback to this. But the core tenet of it, I think, is informative for our discussion today, which is essentially that verbal stimuli, if I tell you something, right? If I say the Leaning Tower of Pisa leans at an angle of 4 degrees, you get that, and it goes into your brain, and the basic building blocks of this information are called what are called logogens, right? And so you have you hear the term tower. You have a sense of this. You have 4 degrees. These are all ideas that are interacting in your head as I say these. Now, if I show you a diagram or an image of this, argues Pavio, you get all the same things that you get from speech, but there's a completely separate channel that deals with this, and these are called imagens, right? And so you have actually 2 hardwired channels that are processing this. And this isn't to say that these are completely separate. Of course, there's a lot of interaction between them. Like if I tell you a story, you're going to you're conjuring images in your head anyway. But the fact that at a hardwired level, images are making very different parts of our brain fire, and maybe we can, the gentleman who looked at the MRIs have maybe even looked at this. So I think this is important for me as a storyteller, but I think important for our discussion of what's our relationship with images anyway. As I said, I'm a novelist, so I'm not a neuroscience scientist. I'm not a visual artist, but I'm interested primarily in how we tell stories. My first novel was about a 12-year-old genius cartographer, and about 3/4 of the way through the book, I realized I couldn't tell the story without showing his maps and diagrams in the margins of the book. So this is exactly what I did. This is what a typical page spread of the book looks like. And so you have the main text here, and then you have these little arrows pointing you to satellite material. And the reader has to figure out how the heck they're going to negotiate between the main text and these little, sidebars. And as I didn't mean to write a book like this. The book kind of told me how it wanted to be written. But I had to learn how to create this book, and I had to learn what was the relationship between image and text, and what did images do, and what did the text do, and what was the dialogue between them. One of my people asked, what was your model that you looked at? And actually, I had to go about 600 years before. I looked at the Illuminated Manuscript that was done by Gutenberg and others. And Illuminated Manuscripts, for those who don't know, started off as biblical texts that had what was called illuminations in the margins of the book. And notice how sizable the margin was. And in these manuscripts, the page spread was really treated as a sort of canvas. And this is a Gutenberg Bible. This is the Tower of Babel. So you can really see these illuminations are really meant to actually illuminate what's going on. As you went on, illuminations became text-based too. These are what are called glosses. This is a law text designed by Nicholas Jensen. He's another master typographer. And you have the main text here, and then you have these little superscript numerals and numbers that guided you back and forth between the main text and the gloss around it. So these were very savvy readers in the Middle Ages who could go back and forth and knew how to read across a page. This is one of my favorite illuminated examples because you got the whole enchilada here, right? You've got the main text, you've got illumination, you've got a gloss, and then you've got a gloss around the gloss. Whoever this guy is wanted to write his notes about the notes, and of course had incredible handwriting that looked like a typeface. But what intrigued me about this was, as I said, the page was really a canvas. There was dialogue between images, there was dialogue between texts, there was dialogue between 2 different types of texts. And what's interesting is that later on, as the academy kind of took over these scientific books, all kind of commentary was relegated to footnotes or endnotes. And for me, this is actually a real loss, I think, because I don't know about you, I'm a slow reader. Whenever I'm asked to go to the bottom of a page, I'm like, oh, God, or the back of the book, and it disrupts the flow, and it's also not how we read, right? At least in English, we read left to right. So I was interested in how do you create a dialogue in the technology of a printed book that embraced the way that we process stories anyway. Another of my influences was the comic book artist Glenn Baxter. Does anyone know him? He's an amazing guy, and I'm still trying to understand his work. But I'm intrigued by his work in part because he has the kind of standard New Yorker image caption. but there's this slight disconnect between image and caption that makes you pause for a second and wonder, did he make a mistake? And actually, this is the wrong caption. And you're like, no, it's the right caption, but what's going on? So for instance, you see this, and then he says, "Welcome, my friends, to another evening of Dutch poetry." And when I see this, I'm like, wait, is that how Dutch poetry actually works? Do they tie up their audience members? What's going on here? And similarly, if you go the other way, how he hated Saturday morning shopping, and then you kind of try to wonder what that would look like. And it's a morose man slumped over the boat of his Boston whaler in the swamp, and what's going on. But I love this. I guess I love the slight disconnect between text and image here. The world that's created and then sort of evaporates very quickly. There's many stories that aren't being told here, right? And the not telling of the stories is where the kind of power or the humor comes from. I also love graphic novels a lot. I'm intrigued by how they tell stories. And for anyone who's spent any time with comics, there's a particular way of advancing the story, right? So we have two panels here, speaking of time. Angry-looking gentleman is pursuing another guy and saying, declaring that now he dies. And the gentleman seems to disagree with that declaration. And then we cut to a crescent moon and a, yeah! And you're asked to fill in what happened between these panels, right? Maybe it was a foot massage, and then he has very sensitive feet, and the guy put down the axe, and he's like, all right, let's talk this over. But probably not, right? Probably what happened in this white space is that he did his deed, and this guy doesn't look so good anymore. But the trick is, with this particular medium, is that this is not shown. This is not shown, right? And that's where the power comes from. Scott McCloud, who wrote this wonderful book called Understanding Comics, and if you're interested in storytelling at all, it's a really great book. He calls this the gutter. The gutter is where what he calls closure happens. And our brains create the closure between the two. We create the time in here. The artist doesn't supply us with this, but we do it ourselves. And in fact, this is one of the tenets of storytelling. This is one of the most important aspects. If we saw every step of the way between this panel and this panel, it would be a very boring story, right? So telling stories is as much about what you leave out, when you leave it out. This is the gutter right here, the cosmic gutter. And so I kept this in mind a lot as I was writing my book. I wanted to know, okay, particularly with images, which you think, we show everything, what do we leave out? So I'll give you an example from my book. One of the emotional through lines of T.S. Spivet is that his younger brother, who is, they live on a ranch in Montana, and his younger brother Leighton was the kind of cowboy prodigal son, and kills himself in an accident in the barn. Accident. I'm not giving anything away. This happens early on in the book. And T.S., who's the 12-year-old genius cartographer, maps everything obsessively, including dinner table conversations. And this was the conversation at the dinner table before and after his brother's death. I had a long paragraph describing what this conversations looked like, and then I drew out this diagram, and I realized much better not to say anything. Let the diagram do the talking, and leave a gutter around this. Leave the white space around so that the audience completes the closure. And then I started seeing this type of not telling and telling all across visual mediums everywhere. One of the challenges of this book was adapting it to the times. We wanted to create an ebook around this. And of course, with all this marginalia, it didn't work on the Kindle. We tried, but it didn't work. So we had to build from the ground up this artisanal iPad app, which was very common in the mid-2000s when the iPad came out. Or I guess it was only, when did the iPad come out? 4 years ago? I don't know. It seems so long ago. But everyone was like, oh, we want to create an app, but it became this kind of you had to build it up by hand. So we thought a lot about, suddenly you have this touch screen, which is actually quite intimate. You actually can touch every element. And so what we decided to do was actually put the marginalia half off the screen so that the reader actually had to go fetch it. And there was this kind of complicit dialogue between reader, writer, and now the reader has become actually a part of the story. So to me, this was interesting, right, as a storyteller, that there's a sort of intimacy created by touch screens. And suddenly the whole notion of what you show and what you don't show is sort of turned on its head. When you have access to all kinds of tools, when you can show video and hyperlinks and images and audio, what choices do you make? If storytelling is the act of leaving things out, and suddenly you have a huge toolbox, what do you decide to leave out? And so that became a challenge for this that we struggled with. I think novels are incredibly persuasive because they leave so much out, because there's not more. You close the book, that's it. You hold it in your hands, you put it down, it stays with you. If it went on and on forever, you wouldn't have that, that kind of, that narrative hum stay with you. But I feel like closure and gutters happen all over the place. In seemingly incongruous places like the safety card that I saw coming here, flying from New York to San Francisco. I always like to look at these, the quality of the diagramming going on. And I'm sorry to report that the US is far behind Europe in the quality of our diagramming. Maybe we'll catch up soon. But when I see this, I think, why are we so drawn to this? Why do we love diagrams in this way? And I think one of the reasons is that it lends a sort of simplicity to what would otherwise be quite a chaotic time, right? So passenger, if oxygen masks fall down above you, all you have to do is follow these 4 easy steps and you shall be fine, right? Step 1, separate the bag from the mask. Step 2, put the elastic band around your head, tighten it. Step 3, breathe normally. Don't smoke while you're breathing normally. And then step 4, attend to your child who's patiently waiting in an oxygenless environment for you to finish. But I think when we see this, we're kind of like, I'm not sure that's how it would be. In fact, we would probably, would we do all these steps? We'd probably be racked by religious guilt. Would we actually attend to our child or just sort of bask in the glows of oxygenation? So I think when we see this, we sense what I call a shadow diagram that kind of looks a little bit like this. So I think diagrams gain their power from these shadow diagrams, which are kind of lurking in that this is actually how it would be. So they tell us the story, but they also don't tell us the real story. And in not telling the real story, they kind of gain a surreality. So, for instance, this is, I think, a beautiful a real picture from an Aeromexico safety card. And you can see what's interesting about this is that there's some really quality details which tell me a whole narrative, right? You can see the kind of casually ruffled hair that clearly has some product in it of the man. His sleeves are rolled up halfway. He's got really nice, tight-fitting trousers on. But I feel like something's missing, right? Namely his face, which is that you want to relate to this man. He's the everyman, but you don't want to show him too much, right? Because he might be dying or on his way to death. So this kind of this casual interface of personality on the one hand, but not person on the other, reminds me of Magritte's, The Son of Man, that you have all the details except the most important details. So I, as you can tell, I love diagrams and kind of like endlessly to scrutinize them. And a rich time for diagramming was right after 9/11, right? As culturally, we were totally freaked out. We didn't know what to do. And so this information clearinghouse called ready.gov was established. I don't know if you remember this. But the government was like, we gotta inform the people of what to do in the event of a terrorist attack. We were all sort of nervous. We were all stocking up on extra batteries. And they made a very curious decision, which was to go very little text, right? And this, again, made me think of Glenn Baxter, because captioning is a powerful thing, right? Again, when I look at a newspaper and I see an image and I read the caption, I rarely question if the caption is real. I don't know what's going on, but I'm like, oh, that must be true. It's attached to an image. But if you take away that caption, suddenly the image can be anything. And I think they were doing this so that if you didn't speak English, you could theoretically understand these directions for anti-terrorism moves. But by divorcing it from language, it became this kind of these liminal instructions that you weren't quite sure what they were instructing you. So these are real USDA diagrams. I want you to look at them and see if you understand what's going on. For me, the gutter is too big. They're asking you to close too much, and in doing it, you don't know which direction to go. So this is like circa 2002, 2003. The internet was blossoming. This was like social media 2.0, and people suddenly realized that they could supply their own captions. So these wonderfully democratic caption contests sort of sprung up across the internet. People realized, I can post something. It's more effective than yelling. People will read it. So these are, I'll just give you a couple of these captions. These are the people's captions for this. These were attempts at closure by desperate citizens. Just trying to explain what's going on here, What I love about this is that I love arrows too, and this arrow is very specific, right? It has this little elbow, and I love how this captioner recognized this could only be parallel parking, right? There's no other movement that this is. And I also like the gentleman in the blue trousers. He has the Cary Grant hip thrust down. But of course, this doesn't answer what happens at 5 minutes, 13 seconds. Is that the cutoff point? So the point is that images have a lot of power politically if they don't say something, if they do say something, and particularly in our image-saturated culture now, this is something to keep in mind and actually, I think, bring a sort of level of scrutiny to. So this is sort of fun. This came out a couple years ago. I mean, a couple months ago. I don't remember if you saw this. Two guys with a Tumblr took this picture of Hillary looking badass on her way to Tripoli to do some negotiations. And all they did was they supplied a narrative by superimposing two images and two simple captions. And it had this incredible effect on Hillary's perception publicly. Someone wrote that suddenly all these posts were like, will she run? Wow, Hillary, she's really transformed herself as Secretary of State. Just from this simple sort of, meme that happened. But it's kind of brilliant. We are narrative creatures, right? All we need is a little bit, and we will close the pictures. I love Meryl Streep. Brunch, obviously. The same picture takes on this amazing quality in different contexts. So if this is like a silly meme, imagine what can actually happen in high-stakes political contexts. And it already has. John Boehner's office, in the middle of that kind of craziness of the healthcare debate, produced this crazy flowchart. And this was an effort on his part to say, the Democrats' plan is really bad. It's going to cause all this, And this pissed off a lot of graphic designers because they're like, look, information design is difficult, so do not try to make it more difficult. And under a post said, do not fuck with graphic designers. A whole string of professionals tried to redesign this flowchart to be graphically pleasing. And they came up with these really interesting redesigns, which, at least to my eyes, are not any more clear. So maybe the moral of the story is just healthcare is really, really confusing. You can use great typefaces, but it's still really confusing. But I love the contentiousness of this, these kind of chart wars that happened. Perhaps the pinnacle of this misuse of information graphics was the complicated time of the days and weeks right after Osama bin Laden's assassination, which was a complicated time for Americans, right? There was this sort of, people didn't know whether to celebrate. There were these kind of cheering in the streets, but everyone's like, someone just died, but he was a bad guy. But so people were kind of stuck in this moral dilemma. But the media wanted to replay this. And you can imagine across the globe, editors were like, to their poor information graphics specialist, give me something. And they're like, well, what do you have? And there was so little information, right? There was like, well, might have been upstairs, he got shot, here's a picture of the compound, that's all that the Pentagon released. And so these guys had to create basically what we wanted. We wanted a blockbuster movie of the SEAL team pursuit the day afterwards. And so this job of creating this closure fell on these poor information graphics people who handled it to varying degrees of success. So these are some examples of, I would argue, bad information graphics. And that you have these sort of clip art of people who may or may not have looked like this. You have women all over the bedroom, you're not sure. You have a ambiguous bloody bed. You have there's just a lot of bling going on, but not a lot of truth. And so there were a lot of examples of this. You can just see people hunting the internet for bad-looking guys, and then there's all kinds of explosions going on, and you get a confused infogasm, right? You're like, okay, I'm kind of getting information, but if you spend any time with this, you're like, no, what is going on here? This is from a Brazilian newspaper that just turned it into a storyboard. This is from a Spanish one that, again, there's SEAL team members shooting at each other from all different directions, which I'm no tactician, but I don't think that's a good plan. And it was just crazy. It was madness. But we ate it up because we wanted a story, right? And we wanted something sexy. So again, right after this, a lot of information designers said, okay, enough's enough. We have to have some kind of rule here. And they wrote a manifesto. And this is point 6. That says, information graphics are neither illustrations nor art. Information graphics are visual journalism and must be governed by the same ethical standards that apply to other areas of the profession. And when you're reading this, you're like, hell yeah, let's have some standards, man. But then when I read this, I'm kind of like, wait a minute. Information graphics are not like any other kind of journalism. There is something sexy about them. They do have something. They are art. There is something that goes on here. They tell a story that's new, that's a way to tell big data in an exciting way, that can synthesize time. And I don't think there's the same set of ethical standards should apply to them. Yes, we should have standards, so we can't just do anything. But we're moving into a new sphere of storytelling that I think demands a new set of standards. So I hear you, Ginner, but I think the conversation is more in depth. And I hope that as we move forward, that novelists like myself will use images in new and exciting ways. Journalists will use images in new, exciting ways, and designers of all sorts. But use them in a way that we're not just trying to sell copy. We're not just trying to make things look sexy, but realize that there's real consequences to how the stories that images tell. So I doctored a Glenn Baxter cartoon to close. Although it could be one of his. So thank you very much.